leader of the Indigenous Peoples team at the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, the FAO in Rome. And his title is Indigenous Peoples Food and Knowledge Systems, Game Changers for Sustainability and Biodiversity.
About what FAO is and the importance of indigenous people's food and knowledge systems. Like Professor Thomas Poch mentioned, I'm going to be talking and hopefully interesting you on why we say that they are game changers for sustainability and biodiversity. And the good news is not that we say that, because when the UN says something is important, but it tends to be more important when scientists or formal scientists, as we call them, say that. No? We work with indigenous scientists, and very often formal scientists disregard indigenous science for a number of reasons. I will try to provoke some of the thoughts that I would like to use to launch the discussion. So let me start by placing some questions for the debate. No? And the first one is, why do we keep expanding agricultural frontiers if there is enough food for everyone in the planet? And I was listening to the previous speaker talking about the increasing tensions and how the world is moving into increasing levels of tension and dispute. No? And why do we produce so much food that we throw away in our garbage, no? Mainly in our homes, but also in the restaurants, and with all the home that we take, that we order online and so forth. No? As you all know, 1/3 of the food that we produce, we throw it away. We don't eat it. It just gets thrown straight into the garbage, no, or lost. So why do we engage in those kind of behaviors? No? And then the other thing, if you ask any children, or if we will talk to some aliens coming from the outer space, and we tell them that such a mega diverse and food diverse planet like Earth has a population of 9 billion people that feed mainly on 3 crops, it will be hard for them to understand. But that's what we do. We have food systems that rely mainly on 3 crops for 50% of our food needs. And with 5 crops, we basically cover almost 80% of the food needs of the humanity. Now, why do we increase military expenditure in the world when we have food insecurity that has been rising since 2021 significantly? No? The good news is that lately it has gone down a bit. No? And are our policies inclusive? If yes, why is oral knowledge and practice that is implemented by more than 600 million people for thousands of years being completely disregarded by academics and scientists? No? Why are we enacting policies that are so incomplete, no? When we try to address issues particularly? Why do we mix local communities with indigenous peoples? What is this mess that we have created ourselves with language that is disregarding indigenous people's rights? And how can we make our food system sustainable if our mental patterns are based on deciding more and more all the time, and they are already unsustainable? How can we be sustainable if our thinking patterns are mainly unsustainable? And then last but not least is that why most of the indicators we use are friction indicators that measure heat, and they don't measure well-being, no? If what we are all trying to do is have a planet where well-being improves. So FAO was created 80 years ago, was founded 80 years ago. As you know, it was founded some days before the UN, with the scope of addressing some of these issues. It's one of the largest specialized UN agencies in the UN cosmos. Here you have the number of UN agencies. You know that the headquarters is based in Rome. This is a very interesting video. If you have the opportunity to watch it, it just tells a little bit the history of FAO since it was founded in 1945 in Quebec, Canada, and why it is placed in Rome. It's interesting because it talks about food, but it also talks about word and contradictions. And probably nowadays to talk about word and contradictions in relation to food is more important than ever. FAO has 197 members. This is 194 countries and 2 associated members, 1 member organization. And the FAO conference is the largest governing body of the organization. It meets every 2 years. Again, it's a very large organization, and I think after the UN is one of the ones in the UN with the largest number of countries. These are the main bodies of the organization. You have the regional conferences. FAO is decentralized in several regions, 5 of them, and they have some regional conference that report to the council and then to the conference. But what is important here, and I want to draw your attention, is to the technical committees. And you see them there. You see the Committee on Agriculture, the Committee on Commodities, Fisheries, Forestry, Food Security. So basically, and this is one of my first take-home messages, many of the discussions related to policies and normative work in relation to food, but also forestry, fisheries, and therefore sustainability and agriculture, they take place in Rome. They don't occur and they don't take place in Geneva. They don't take place in New York. They don't happen in Washington. They take place in Rome. And this is news for many people because they think that many of these aspects and issues are discussed at the UN in New York, but the reality is that they are discussed in Rome. And that's when the ministers, specialized ministers of your respective countries come here to talk about policies that affect your countries and daily lives. So these are some of the technical committees, as I was hinting earlier, the Agriculture, Forestry, Fisheries, and the World Food Security Committee, which is quite important. It just met this week, and it's one of the reasons why we have been extremely busy over the past weeks. But it also hosts FAO several international treaties on plant genetic resources, the Rotterdam Convention on pollutants, the Codex Alimentarius Commission. Every time you go to buy some food and it has some food additives or preservatives, these are discussed here in Rome. And of course, the World Treaty Against Illegal Fishing, which is a major issue. These are some of the main FAO flagship publications, and I will be talking in a minute about the state of food and agriculture, which is the one that tells every year what is the number of people that are food insecure in the world. And this is extremely important because we don't know exactly how many people live in the planet. So to calculate how many people are food insecure in the planet is a major undertaking. These are the regional offices of the organization and the centralized offices. I'm not going to extend myself here. This is some of the departments. The Indigenous Peoples Unit is housed in the partnerships and outreach stream within the FAO department. And these are, of course, the SDGs. And I'm already moving into the subject of the conversation, which is the importance of Indigenous peoples and some of the answers that they can provide in an unstable world that we are in today. So the FAO Indigenous Peoples Unit that I had the pleasure and the honor to guide and that I founded in 2014, we provide policy and strategic advice to the member countries and work with Indigenous peoples closely. We implement the FAO policy on Indigenous peoples, and of course, we support the compliance of our organization with the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples of 2007, sorry. And we generate knowledge and we coordinate the FAO's work with the three main UN mechanisms in the UN working with Indigenous peoples. The UN Permanent Forum that is housed in New York, the expert mechanisms on the rights of Indigenous peoples, and the special rapporteur that are housed in Geneva. So these are some of the key functions of what we do. And what is important here is that we host three global secretariats. And these are the three global secretariats. One is the Global Hub on Indigenous Peoples' Food and Knowledge Systems. We organize also for the UN, the only UN global dedicated forum for Indigenous youth. And we host the largest Rome group of friends of countries with Indigenous peoples. We have 7 pillars of work and 2 thematic areas. And I'm going to be talking largely about traditional knowledge and climate change and Indigenous peoples' food and knowledge systems to explain why Indigenous peoples' food and knowledge systems are game changers for biodiversity and sustainability. FAO has more than 70 free downloadable publications on Indigenous peoples, from matrifocal societies to the importance of vulnerability of mountain peoples and food insecurity, analysis on shifting cultivation and importance for food security, aspects of labeling and certification. You can download any materials for free. One part of what we do as a UN organization is to provide public good, and everything is free and everything can be used in your work, in your research. So who are Indigenous peoples and why do we say Indigenous peoples? As you know, there is not a definition. We don't define Indigenous peoples, we characterize them. And the FAO policy on Indigenous peoples basically spans on the Martinez-Cobos characterization of 1986. And it talks about the priority in time, the voluntary perpetuation of cultural distinctiveness, self-identification, and then experiences of subjugation, marginalization, dispossession, and discrimination. It's very interesting because how many Indigenous peoples are there in the world? Well, there are, what ILO said in the last estimate is that there are 476 million Indigenous people, but this is from data from only 53 countries, when in reality, we know that Indigenous people live in more than 98 countries. So it is safe to say that Indigenous peoples are more than 500 million people across the world, which basically makes them the third most populous country in the world if they were put in a single geographic state. There's some estimates about the level of poorness, but what is very important is the fact that they belong to 5,000 different groups, and they speak 4,000 out of the 6,000 plus remaining languages in the world. So if we talked about indigenous peoples, we are talking about biodiversity, but we are also talking about cultural and linguistic diversity, and these go hand in hand. When we talk about indigenous peoples, many people think that they live in Latin America and the Caribbean, but this is the third region in the world in indigenous peoples population. More than 70% of them live in Asia and the Pacific. And the second region in the world, which comes as a surprise for many, is Africa in terms of indigenous population. There's 7 sociocultural regions in the world with indigenous population. And it is very important because there's Arctic indigenous peoples, there's Pacific, and there is also, of course, Central Asia, Transcaucasian, Russia indigenous peoples. Why do we say indigenous peoples with an S? As you know, the UN was created not for countries, not for a state. The UN Charter talks about the peoples of the world, and the FAO Constitution talks about the peoples of the world. We don't talk about the states, we don't talk about countries. And I want to highlight this because over time, more and more, the spirit of the creation of the UN has moved away from the peoples and has moved towards the governments, not even the states. And this is it is a problem because the fathers and mothers of the foundations of the UN had a much more humanistic approach to humankind than what we see today, where states, and not even states, but governments or parties in governments capture the narrative and deviate the narrative at national level, very often to go against international agreements that have been subscribed and endorsed by the member states earlier. We say indigenous peoples, and this is the definition in a way, again, the characterization, sorry, that was endorsed in the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples in 2007, in a way to break many of the despective terms that had been used over time to refer to indigenous peoples, and that are a plethora of terminology that sometimes is despective, sometimes is used with discriminatory purposes. But the S is the one that puts forward a narrative that is global and that allows indigenous peoples to start advocating for their rights as right holders. These are some of the main tests on for indigenous peoples. The first one, of course, is the ILO Convention 169, which was endorsed in 1989, and then the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples of 2007. But of course, there's the Convention on Biological Diversity and the importance of free, prior, and informed consent that is first introduced, or some of the elements are first introduced on ILO 169, and then they are developed in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples in 2007. These are 2 important documents for us in FAO, the FAO Policy on Indigenous Peoples, and then the joint work plan with FAO and Indigenous Peoples. And it was in this joint work plan that we drafted with indigenous leaders from the 7 sociocultural regions in 2015, when they first indicated that they wanted FAO to continue the leadership that we've been having since 2006 on indigenous people's food and knowledge systems. This is a timeline. I'm not going to expand myself here. I'm just going to perhaps highlight that in 2004, the voluntary guidelines on the right to food were endorsed by the countries in FAO. This is 3 years before the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And already the voluntary guidelines on the right to food highlighted that for indigenous peoples to have access to and the guarantee of the right to food, they need to have access to their territories and they need to exercise their collective rights to their lands, natural resources, and territories. This is very much forward-looking, and in a way, it establishes the linkage between collective rights, access to territories, and food, which is fundamental to the work that we are doing. I'm not going to spend time here. Perhaps we've been working a lot in the Arctic. We are very proud of working with the Arctic, because as you know, it's difficult to understand climate change, and unless we work with the Arctic, we do not understand climate change. And what we are hearing from the Inuit and the Sami and some of the reindeer nomadic pastoralists that we work with is that it's more concerning than we first anticipated. I want to talk about the indigenous people's food and knowledge systems. And of course, I had to mention bananas. As you know, banana is one of the largest crops in the world, is one of the largest cash crops in the world. But most of the bananas that you eat daily, they are not real bananas. It's just water encapsulated in a yellow container. They are normally the Cavendish variety. As you know, the bananas come from the Pacific region, from Indonesia. And one of the things why working with indigenous people's food and knowledge systems is so important is because for a long time, it was thought that bananas did not have vitamin A, and because they say that it could not have beta carotene. The reality is that more food composition analysis has been done on bananas, and there are several of the varieties in the Pacific and in Indonesia that are full of vitamin A. And by eating one of those orange bananas a day, you could already give several times the supplement of vitamin A that children need, and that, as you know, is one of the major sources of micronutrient deficiency in under 5. So just to give you a highlight on how indigenous peoples can resolve many of the issues that sometimes our anthropocentric, utilitaristic approach to life does not allow us to see. So, of course, we are not in track to achieve SDG 2. As you know, SDG 2 is to eliminate hunger, and our global food systems are causing great damages to the environment. They are some of the largest greenhouse gases emitters. They use the majority of the water, and they are driving the deforestation at global level. The data could be estimated. It's hard to get the full data, but they are not off track in terms of where we are. And what is very interesting is what I was mentioning before, is that there is more food than ever. We have never produced more food than today. There's food for every single human being in the planet. And the good news is that the past 2 years, 2022, 2023, the food insecurity and the hunger has gone down. It moved from almost 800 million to from 744 million, it has moved down to about 673 million people that are hungry in 2024. And this is good news because as you see in the graphic, since 2017, the curve and the reduction on food insecurity changed, and it is going upwards again until 2022. And the good news is that the last 2 years it has reduced. But we are talking of 2.3 billion people in the world that are still moderately or food insecure. And again, why are we expanding the agricultural frontier and producing more food if 33% of all the food that we produce is either waste or is lost during the distribution chain and in our households during the food system chain that we are using and that we have in place at global level. But what is very interesting is that despite the very narrow food base that we have, we know that there's more than 7,000 edible plants in the planet, and 150 of them have a commercial potential. 103 provide 90% of the food we eat, and again, 3 of them produce 56% of all the calories consumed by humans. If we add potatoes and we add soya, we are talking of almost 80 to 90% of the kilocalories consumed by humans. Now, why we don't talk about agriculture and why do we talk about the indigenous people's food and knowledge systems? To explain that, I always use a pencil. So I have a pencil. I know most of you don't use pencils anymore. You use tablets and electronic devices, but pencils are very important because it explains how over time humankind has been feeding itself through food systems. And there you see the length of the pencil. And just if we could use that as a metaphor, the very tip of the pencil that we put in the razors or in the sharpener will be agriculture. And the lead that we use to paint and to write is what we refer to as green revolution. So we tend to be memorized by associating food with green revolution and agrochemicals. The reality is that humankind has been feeding itself for thousands of years without agrochemicals, without green revolution, and to our knowledge, the systems and continuous food systems that have perdured the longest in humankind are those of the Aboriginals in Australia. So, as you know, in our formal science, we try to put things in boxes, and we try to analyze them to claim that we are experts on a given subject, and that's how we get through in our academic world. But indigenous peoples looked at things with a circular mind and through interconnectivity. They looked at different dimensions all at once, and these are some of the aspects that are intertwined in any indigenous people's food system: the resources and biodiversity, health and nutrition, language and culture, and of course, reciprocity, circularity, and seasonality. This is why when we represent indigenous people's food and knowledge systems, we need to use circular representations, because our Cartesian models of linear analysis do not match the reality in which they refer to their food systems. This is very interesting. If we overlap a map of biodiversity, of cultural diversity, and of protected areas and indigenous peoples' territories, there's almost a complete overlap all across the world. The biodiverse pockets coincide with indigenous peoples' territories and coincide with the places where the largest number of cultures and languages are. And this is very important because one of my take-home messages is that as a culture and language disappear, so does the knowledge system that hosts that food system and the botanical knowledge that is encapsulated in those languages that are being lost, because most of them are oral. And with that, thousands of years of indigenous science accumulated through observation disappear in front of us. I know that you have heard about the living encyclopedias that the indigenous elders are. And from my short experience working with indigenous peoples over the past years, I have seen that when some of these elders die, that knowledge is lost forever. This is an important book for us. It won in 2021 the best sustainability book. They called us from the Alfred Nobel House in Sweden, so we thought it was a spam. We thought they were trying to sell something to us. In reality, it turned out that they have read the book, actually, which nowadays people don't read books, but they have read the book and they found it interesting, and they gave us the award of best sustainability book. And we accepted with the condition that the award that they wanted to give to FAO was given to every single of the indigenous communities and organizations that participated in this publication. They gave us the award from the Alfred Nobel House, and here we analyzed 39 drivers that are associated with the sustainability or lack of sustainability of indigenous people's food and knowledge systems. And they ensure the continuity or the disappearance of indigenous people's food systems over time. Why are indigenous people's food and knowledge systems so important for FAO? Again, we started this work with Yale University and CNES Center in 2006, and we've been working over time refining the methodology to the point that in 2018 we conducted a high-level expert seminar on indigenous people's food and knowledge systems in FAO. It was the first time in the history of FAO that we organized a high-level expert seminar with over 200 participants to discuss about the relevance of indigenous people's food and knowledge systems. And the main conclusion of that was the need to create a think tank at global level that could guide the work and the narrative of indigenous peoples in processes of co-creation of knowledge. This is the Global Hub on Indigenous Peoples' Food and Knowledge Systems that today has 38 member institutions and 3 global research networks at global level, and it has expertise from the 7 sociocultural regions. Today it has 9 drafting committees that are producing collective papers. This is a little bit the map of the Global Hub on Indigenous Peoples' Food and Knowledge Systems. And these are some of the members that are, you see from the different foundations, research centers, the Sami Parliament, indigenous organizations, the UN Permanent Forum. So it's a compendium of indigenous and non-indigenous working together to advance the narrative of indigenous people's food and knowledge systems. What is important here is that in 2020, we ran the endorsement or the creation of the Global Hub through the Technical Committee on Agriculture. It was a very tense year for us in terms of negotiations because, as you know, the world was divided between the meat-producing countries and countries that wanted to support animal welfare. So it was a very agitated debate at the Technical Committee on Agriculture. To our surprise, they all agreed that we needed to have a global hub, a think tank on indigenous people's food and knowledge systems. What is very important is that in 2021, in the process or in the lead to the UN Food System Summit in New York, the Global Hub produced what is called the White Wipala paper on indigenous people's food systems. And this was a revolution because it was a collective paper written by indigenous and non-indigenous. There were more than 60 contributors from different organizations from across the world. And that led to, for the first time, and that is connected to the title of my presentation, formal scientists recognizing that indigenous people's food and knowledge systems are game changers for sustainability and for biodiversity, and that they can inform many of the changes that we need to incorporate to transform our currently unsustainable global food systems into systems that are more respectful with the environment, more respectful with the cycles, natural cycles, and more respectful with the biodiversity limits of the different ecosystems. We also released a very provocative paper in Nature, in the Nature journal, questioning the hierarchies of knowledge that are being used to enact policies on food systems, explaining how, like I was saying at the beginning of my intervention, oral knowledge is completely disregarded in these processes, and everything is based on written knowledge, mainly in English and in dominant cultural languages, disregarding the actual knowledge holders that know about indigenous people's food and knowledge systems, and disregarding the knowledge holders that actually know about mobility, biodiversity, and of course, how to combat climate change at territorial level. What is important is that the Global Hub on Indigenous Peoples Food Systems approached the Committee on World Food Security and requested for the first time that the Committee on World Food Security please to include in the discussions of the member countries the issue of indigenous people's food and knowledge systems. To our surprise, this has been included. It took us 2 years of negotiations. We had many coffees, a lot of lobbying, a lot of negotiation with countries that supported the approach, massaging other countries that were against the topic. But for the first time in the history of FAO in 80 years, the member countries are going to discuss in 2027 the importance of indigenous people's food and knowledge systems. And this is a major undertaking for us. We're extremely proud of this because it was not easy. And now the challenge is to ensure that we have enough evidence in written form for the member countries to have informed policy discussions. Some of the key messages are, like I say, that they are game changers for sustainability and resilience, that indigenous people's food systems unfortunately are disappearing very rapidly, threatened by conflict, displacement, and extractive industries. At the same time, indigenous people's food systems are innovative and they are dynamic. Many people think that indigenous people's food and knowledge systems are prehistoric. They are things of the past. They are some of the most agile and adaptive food systems that you can find nowadays. And what is extremely interesting is the importance of indigenous people's youth. Unless we include indigenous youth in the processes of discussions and in the policy processes and in the new solutions combining technology with ancestral knowledge, indigenous people's food systems will disappear in the next 20 years. I think we are about to assist to a major collapse of indigenous people's food and knowledge systems across the world unless we roll our sleeves and we do something today. The reality is that in most of your countries, there is not any single policy at national level dedicated to support or protect indigenous people's food and knowledge systems. There is not. And if there is one, please send it to us because we've been mapping out indigenous people's policies and we haven't found any supporting indigenous people's food and knowledge systems. I'm going to jump the coalition and I want to move here. We created this coalition in 2021, but I'm going to jump now, if you allow me, to biocentric restoration. And I think this is extremely important because it closes the circle of the importance of indigenous people's food and knowledge systems. And it really places indigenous peoples as knowledge holders and not only as right holders. You will all agree with me that indigenous peoples are the best guardians of biodiversity in the planet. Yet, when we undertake restoration initiatives in our respective countries, we tend not to include them, and very often we displace them, or we completely disregard their knowledge with respect to botanical knowledge in the territory to use that to restore territories with a different approach. We started this journey in 2018 with indigenous peoples leaders when we confronted some of the policies that in a country in Asia were being put forward by the Ministry of Forestry to restore degraded lands by displacing indigenous people from their ancestral lands. It didn't make any sense to us. So one of the things that we did, we started a global program that started initially in India and Thailand, and today has extended to more than 7 countries. We are working now in more than 1,500 hectares. There's about 400 hectares currently under restoration. We are using in a single initiative more than 170 different species. And all of this is based on the indigenous people's cosmogony and the knowledge they have for their territories. It's not only botanical knowledge, it's a spiritual knowledge and it's cosmogonic knowledge. Why indigenous peoples biocentric restoration? Like I say, is the best way to put indigenous peoples as knowledge holders at the center of efforts that can restore degraded lands where they grew up, and they know much better than us what are the relations in those ecosystems. But what is very important here is why we call it biocentric. We call it biocentric using this example here of the trees of the bridges of life. And these bridges of life are, you can find them in the Northeast India, where the people, they weave the flying roots of the bridges in a way that Mother Earth, by growing every year, makes the bridge stronger. So this is the example of accompanying, in a way, the natural process of Mother Earth in a respectful manner, but understanding and reading very well what the processes are to move away from anthropocentric high intervention models into models of accompaniment by understanding the cosmogony and by reading the territory. So like the elders say, we are not restoring ecosystem, we are restoring the lost memory of the territories and the ecosystem. We are restoring relationships, we are restoring ecosystems, but more important, we are restoring the transmission of knowledge, inter and intragenerational among elders, women, and youth. And this is fundamental not only for the language, but it's also fundamental for the indigenous people's food and knowledge systems, and it's also fundamental for the continuity of the work that is being done at the community level by the youth and the elders. The youth are migrating to the urban centers, and the food systems, but the knowledge systems are collapsing in front of our eyes. And this is a glimpse of the global program and the different initiatives that we are working with. In some of the countries like Brazil, we have expanded the work right now. And here you see the different indigenous nations that we are working with across the countries. So with this, I would like to close my intervention explaining why it is so relevant in a way to have indigenous peoples at the center of the debate that we are having on indigenous peoples on food systems, and to consider some of their solutions and some of the practices as hindsights on how we could make our currently unsustainable food systems and transform them into more sustainable and more respectful with Mother Earth. There you have some of the food links, some of the web links to our materials, and here you have some of the links to the documents that I mentioned in the presentation. And I would like to leave it here and stop the PowerPoint, Thomas, if you allow me to launch the discussion. Thank you for your attention, and my apologies for the long presentation. I know I went rapidly, but I wanted to introduce some of the ideas that are in a way framing the work that we are doing at global level, but also at community level with different nations across the world.
Excellent. This was a wonderful and very rich presentation. And I see any questions? Okay, Skylab, you start. Unmute yourself, please.
Yes, thank you very much, Yon, for this presentation, and specifically to bring the indigenous food culture and doing the entire activism and making the world know about the importance of food diversity. Because when we talk about indigenous food security, it basically talks about diversity, which is supposed to be the main ethos of any food security system in any country around the world. In India, I would like to take and kind of information that you said that in a few states like Punjab, Haryana, and or in nearby states, they actually try to utilize green revolution. And after 40 years now, when we try to understand the implication of green revolution, one of the major implication, that is what the scientists say, that there is incredible number of increase of cancer patients in nearby and in those states, specifically in Punjab, for instance. And not only that, there is one special train which runs to take these or to carry these patients to a particular cancer hospital. So I think this is high time that the world recognizes that there is need of understanding the value of natural, organic, food system, which needs to be diverse. Thank you very much for bringing this into account, Yon.
Thank you so much, Saho Dandevat, and thank you so much for your comments. I personally know Professor Swaminathan, one of the fathers of the Green Revolution, and talking with him, obviously the Green Revolution was needed to increase food production at that given time. I think we have all learned that it is extremely effective in providing quantities of food, cheap food. The food has been extremely affordable despite when we see the increase of cost of living in most countries, the food has remained in general affordable thanks to the Green Revolution, but it has brought so many other issues. And one of them has been, of course, the reduction of diversity in the food supply and the concentration of technology and resources, particularly from oil fuels related around very few crops. And this has had a tremendous impact on many different levels. And one of them is that in our minds, most of us, and I invite all of you, when you go home today, open the closet in your kitchen and organize your food by food crops. And you will see that you are eating very few food crops. Most of the things you're eating comes from those 5 food crops that I mentioned. And there are many different ways of feeding ourselves. No? So one of them is, of course, through the Green Revolution. But we challenge that it is sustainable to continue eating such a narrow food base with such an input of technology and agrochemicals, when at the same time, many of the issues that we are having are related to biodiversity loss. No? So there can be different ways, and this is some of the things that we are exploring, all of us together. I work in India with the International Year of Millets. I work with the government of India supporting the revival of millets. And when we see how millets and sorghum, for instance, sorghum in Africa and millets in Asia had been displaced by other foods and other crops, it's a tremendous loss for the dietary diversity of large segments of the population, indigenous or not. And this happens with many other foods, unfortunately, that are being displaced by the commercial push that is associated with some of these mainstream food crops. This, in the end, is humankind is homogenizing minds, and it's homogenizing minds and the way we think by homogenizing the way we eat. No? It's all the same process of homogenization. And I believe in diversity, and I think that to have diverse minds, we need to have diverse foods. That's at least what I've learned this year. But thank you so much for your comment.
Okay, Anshal was next, and then Chia-Yun and Matt after that.
Hi, Yon. Thank you for the wonderful presentation. As you spoke about, whose knowledge counts, I have been also working with indigenous people in India, mainly in Himachal Pradesh, Lahaul Spiti and Kinnaur region. So when I reached out to people there, I understood, like they said that people do come, take our interview, and with our consent and everything, like free and prior consent knowledge under Red Plus argument. But then they say, what is the use of it? Like they take our knowledge, we are never being credited for it. And even though we raise this argument with them, then also most of the times they are discredited. So even I have looked into how the NGOs or especially the outsider NGOs have been working. So even they do the same. They're bringing in people from different parts of India, especially in Spiti region, and they give all the credits to the organization who is funding them, but not to the people and whose knowledge hasn't been protecting. So what can these people do actually, to protect themselves from such kind of incidents? Thank you.
I mean, there's different things that can be done, but there are many different answers. One of the ones that we are working on, we are working on guidelines of a respectful and ethical co-creation of knowledge with indigenous peoples communities to avoid destruction of information. That I think is what you alluded to, no? Destruction of research, and researchers and experts and UN go into the communities extracting information and then don't giving anything back. We try not to work like that. We work with indigenous organizations. Actually, the Global Hub is composed of indigenous organizations, and we try to move away from that way of doing work. I will quote some of the words of my friend Herb Nakiyamak from the Inuit Circumpolar Council, where he says, at the beginning, they came to do research on us, then they came to do research with us, and now we are the ones doing research on ourselves, so that we don't need, in a way, the foreigners, the people from outside the community coming and doing research on the community. More and more, they are leading their own processes of research. And I think any efforts from our organizations to support that know-how so that they can conduct their own research in their own terms and manage their data is extremely important. As you know, the last session of the expert mechanism on the rights of indigenous peoples in Geneva this year was about data sovereignty and the importance of indigenous people generated data and the right to manage, create their own data. I think we're still a long way to go. Also, the language diversity is extremely useful for many things. It's also a barrier in many indigenous communities when it is time to, in a way, homogenize data that could be comparable across different communities that speak different or belong to different linguistic groups. So there are pros and cons, like in everything in life. And of course, we need to ensure that the communities can drive their own research process and stop that kind of extractive research that sometimes our institutions inadvertently or divertly undertake. Thank you so much.
Xie Yun?
Hi. Hi, thank you for your talk. You touch us on how to decolonizing and challenging the dominance of the randomized controlled trial as the gold standard in constructing knowledge. And your work at the Global Hub also this challenge makes a great part of it. So I wonder, how do you negotiate the epistemic legitimacy? Meaning, how do you reconstitute what counts as the rigorous proof when indigenous people's ecological knowledge, not just food knowledge, is that's empirical, longitudinal, and it's community verified, instead of as opposed to the current more customarily accepted among the current science community. And it's not entirely, I mean, this indigenous people's ecological knowledge is not entirely statistically framed. So I'm wondering, are you designing a new evaluative framework that can put experimental and scientific methods on equal footing?
Okay, well, it's a complex question, so I will try to give you a complex answer, but it's a very complex question. I think the first thing is I'm skeptical about what we see with dominant science process of verification. I'm a native of Spain, and I saw the scientists telling us when I was a child that olive oil was very bad for you, and they used to drink sunflower oil. And then we learned, and this was done with all kinds of empiric evidence from scientists, from PhDs, triple PhDs, and all kinds of lab analysis. It turned out that there was a lobby, mainly put together by French multinationals, that were selling sunflower oil, and they tried to open the Spanish olive oil market with all kinds of scientific reports. So I think nowadays science can prove, and dominant science can prove anything through empirical processes. Now, what we do, I think the main difference, and I always say that, of course, in a spirit of provocation, I think the main difference from a formal science or scientist and an indigenous people science, because for us they are indigenous people science, is that when a formal science gets their hypothesis wrong, they just go back to their lab and they, in a way, reiterate the testing and looked at their variables. When an indigenous people scientist get their variables wrong, they die, no? And they starve. So the main difference is through years of accumulation observation and very accurate reading of the environment, they are capable of coming up with practical and pragmatic situations and solutions of which the food security and the continuity of their practices in their community depend on. That's very different from scientists that at the university level are undertaking research, and they might get it right or wrong, but their food does not depend necessarily on that. So I think we need to expand and decolonize our ways of thinking from the dominant culture. And me myself, I have a university degree and I have formal education and so forth, but I have to relearn many of the things that I thought I have taken as science, and expand the notion of science to incorporate many of the things. Now, when you move into indigenous people's medicine and you move into traditional medicine, this is a field of experimentation that challenges many of the notions that we have to understand empirical evidence. Because many of the things that we see through indigenous healing methods, in a way, challenges many of the things that the formal medicine is quoting and is promoting. No? And I'm sure you will agree with me. And we see that in China, we see that in many ancient cultures, and we see that in many indigenous cultures. But what is very interesting is that pharmaceutical companies have understood this before other branches of science. And most of the medicines that we are taking nowadays, they have evolved from indigenous people's science and indigenous people's knowledge, very often without acknowledging that knowledge in the communities. So I could argue that there are many different ways of doing science, and indigenous people's science is one of them. In our case, many of we write collective papers with indigenous scientists, as well as non-indigenous scientists, academics and researchers. And what we try to do is put forward co-creations of knowledge that in any case, we undertake some of the excellent processes in the formal science methods, like the peer review. We do peer review the documents, but we also incorporate orality. I don't know how many of you in the call incorporate oral knowledge in your work, because it's extremely difficult. And to incorporate, and if you don't incorporate oral knowledge, you are disregarding the knowledge of 600 million people between pastoralists and indigenous across the world that base very often their science in mobility, which is another thing that we do not incorporate in our models. We disregard mobility, we disregard oral science. And this is, in my opinion, a major loss for the work that we are all trying to do collectively. But everything is imperfect, and I don't have the solutions or the answers to many of your questions, Chia-Jung, but I think it's a process. And I think by expanding the way we think and decolonizing some of what we understand as right and what we understand as wrong, we get closer to understanding new realities that are very disconnected from how we were brought up when we went to university and so forth. It's a process. It's a de-learning process to learn again.
We have Matt, Joseph, and Carol in that order. Matt first.
Yes, thank you very much for the great talk. I was wondering if you could show the circular diagram again, because it seemed like there was a lot of detail on that, and whether you wanted to say more about those ways of thinking and how they might be useful both for indigenous people and for others who could learn from them.
You have the option of making your slides available, Yon, and then I would mail them out to whoever is asking for them.
Let me see if I can. Thank you so much, Matt. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, sorry. I'm looking for the. Okay, there's the circular calendar. Can you see it? Let me see if I can make it bigger. Yeah. I mean, we have many. We have so many that in the Blue Book, for each food system that we profile, we've been profiling food systems with indigenous communities for several years now. And in many of them, we have to, this one is a general one where you see the main elements of indigenous people's food systems. But if I could find, I don't have it here, I think. If I could find another one of the, if I could find another one of a food system where you see the details, extremely interesting because it really challenged the notions that we have of putting things in linearity. Basically, when you put things in linearity, I don't have it here. I will mail it to you, Matt, or if you can look at the blue book, if you can look at this blue book, let me see if I can do this again. Excuse my clumsiness with the software, but if you could, if you look at the blue book, there it is. If you look at the blue book, where is the blue book? Now, if you go to, can you see it now?
Yes.
If you go to that blue book, it's online. You can Google it. You will see that each food system has a circular calendar. Now, what is interested of the circular is not even a circular calendar; it's a circular description of how the food system operates. This one you see in the cover is the Ticuna Cocamayawa from Colombia, and they have flooding systems in the Tarapoto Lake complex in the Amazon, and everything follows the flooding of the rivers and the deflooding of the rivers, from fisheries to food generation, food production, all the different activities. And they see that circularity in everything, not only in the way they perceive the processes, but also in the way they perceive the animal life and in the way they perceive the hunting life. I think it's very difficult for us that come from Cartesian models of thought to understand how indigenous peoples approach everything with a circularity. And very often this is related to their medicine, and it is related to the rituals, and it is related to the connection they have between the different worlds. The cosmogonic and spiritual world, the world of the ancestors, the world of the animals, the sacred animals, and how all of these processes are intertwined. And I will give you an example. We work with the Shukuru people. We undertake restoration with the Shukuru people. Everything is based in a bird. If that bird is not present, they believe that that restoration will not be successful. So very often it's more important to get the presence of that bird in the ecosystem again and a certain type of bee than to start planting things randomly. And that's how they see the interconnection in those calendar circulars of how their systems operate. It's completely different from how we think. I will, Matt, if you agree, I will, if you can Google the book, that will be great. Otherwise, I will try to send you some of the circular calendars if you're interested, if Thomas shares your email address.
Absolutely.
Great, thank you very much. There's one other brief point I wanted to touch on, which is that you were saying about the small number of crops. And I think that, would you agree that if you have a small number of crops, you actually have the potential to exhaust the soil much more quickly?
You have touched a fascinating subject because, as you know, the forest is not over the soil, it's under the soil. The problem with reducing biodiversity over the soil is that it kills the biodiversity under the soil or in the soil. So what you see on top, that those monocrop fields, in a way, is a replica of what you have in the soil. And eventually, I mean, the whole concept of the Green Revolution is adding chemicals to, in a way, compensate for that biodiversity lost in the soil. But if there are certain areas of science where we are trying to learn, one is the soil science, and the other one is, of course, the atmospheric relationships. And now you see that more and more we are learning about the atmospheric rivers and how humidity operates in the planet, and even the systems, how the systems have certain intelligence to self-regulate themselves. So I think there's a whole realm of understanding on Mother Earth and in the environment that we have not been able to grasp with our current tools. And the monocropping is moving us away from understanding this, because we are basically reducing drastically the biodiversity in the soil as well as the biodiversity on top of the soil. And I will say, if you allow me to be provocative, that is also reducing the biodiversity in our brains. But of course, that's not the way.
Okay,
Okay,
Joseph
yeah.
is next. Unmute yourself. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much, Fernandez. Now, my contribution question is that I've been a teacher for the last 39 years, from 1980 to 2019, in nomadic pastoralist land, that is the Maasai community. This area, nomadic pastoralists, depend on animals, that is livestock, for survival. In other words, food, milk, meat, and blood, because of the aridity of the land. Now, in schools, when FAO was very active in providing for lunch and more so for break drinks, that is porridge, the accessibility and retention in schools in the nomadic pastoralists, that indigenous Maasai, it was very high. But of late, food is not available in those institutions. And given the climate change that so far has affected the land through famine and drought, a protracted drought for many months, means that many of these learners remain out of school. What is the solution of food far from Rome to nomadic pastoralists of the Maasai in the Republic of Kenya? Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, Brother Joseph. I thought from your name that you were Maasai, and I'm very glad to know that you're in Maasai land. I don't know, in the sense that I worked for many years coordinating emergencies with FAO, and I was one of the first ones in FAO. My father was a nomadic pastoralist, and I started in FAO before the Global Hub on Indigenous Peoples Food Systems. I started the Global Hub on Pastoralists, in a way as a tribute to my grandfather and to the knowledge that he had that I didn't see was being reflected in the work of my organization. But I don't know. I don't want to give you an answer for Kenya and nomadic pastoralist schools. What I was going to say is that I advocated for situations of drought and emergencies in my previous work some years back to support the livestock herd instead of giving food directly for the children, because in many of these communities, at least, and a lot of the work I did was in pastoralist communities in Ethiopia, was that the metabolic system of the children was not adapted to wheat-based foods. So when the children are undernourished and you give them a wheat-based food at the school or through food aid, very often the children are having diarrhea and they're already having signs of malnutrition, and you make things worse. So instead, I supported feeding and saving the herd to make sure that they could regain again their food base, which is, as you say, is milk, blood, and meat based. I don't know in the case of Kenya. I think there's other colleagues in my institution more prepared than me to answer your question. So allow me to take your question and see if I can get you a better answer through colleagues that have more expertise than I do. What I have observed in other pastoralist and nomadic communities with indigenous peoples is that very often the states do not have the right type of schools unless they are mobile schools. And I think the best example of the ones we have found is in Russia, some of the mobile schools that accompany some of the mobile communities. And very often the school meal programs are not targeted, or they are not tailored for nomadic and pastoralist communities, but they are normally designed for stabilized, more agricultural type communities. But I don't want to take what I'm saying with a pinch of salt, because again, there's colleagues in my organization with more expertise than me on your question, and I will try to get to them and send you a better answer if you allow me, please.
Very good. Branko Milanovic has joined us, but we have one more question from Carol, and then we transition to the next session. Carol, please.
Thank you very much for this opportunity. I have a very quick question. So how do you see the role of geographical indications or labels in promoting indigenous food in both economic terms, but also in tangible cultural heritage terms? Thank you.
Thank you so much for the question, Carol. This is the $2 million question. Everybody's asking this nowadays. The main issue with the geographic indications, the ones that we know, and of course there's some very good examples in Italy, in Spain, in France, on the geographic indications to in a way add value to the product with the intangible and cultural addition to the value chain and to the product. But the challenge with indigenous peoples is who is going to certify that, at what cost, and what mechanism is the one to do that. We've been working with indigenous people from across the world on labeling and certification, and some of the best models we have seen are the ones of the Maori, which are based on self-certification and a very strict control, maintaining their cosmogony and the spirit and essence of Maori values in the food value chain. But it's a complex issue. Indigenous peoples more and more are interested in accessing their market at preferential rate with more added value, because the risk of not doing it is having people from outside the communities stealing the products and then making millions. Of course, you know the stevia. I'm sure you have heard of the stevia, which is a Guarani plant that was stolen by, I think it was a Swiss scientist who became millionaire, and they never saw a penny. You know? So we see examples of this daily. Most of if some of you are in the US, when you go to the supermarket and you read superfood, in most cases that's an indigenous people's food that is being capitalized by a company that is not indigenous in most cases. So there's a lot of work that we need to do differently, and indigenous peoples are fully aware of that. We have a request now from Canada to organize probably next year a high-level expert seminar on labeling and certification of indigenous people's foods with indigenous people's nations, and we hope to have more information for you. No? But certainly it's an area where we need to expand, and the current denomination of origin and protected areas of origin cannot cover, as they are today, indigenous people's food and knowledge systems, also because of the diversity and very often the small scale of production or generation that many of the indigenous people's foods have. There's another aspect on that, and with that I'm closing my intervention, and it's the fact that indigenous peoples, many of the foods are wild or semi-wild, and you cannot scale them up in terms of commercial supply, particularly to meet the urban demand from the urban centers. And this is a major city that we see, for example, with the hunter-gatherer communities, that when they try to gear their activities to supply for the urban centers, it's very difficult to maintain the threshold capacity of the environment and of the ecosystem. But thank you so much for the question, and we want to, if you're interested in that area, I would like to be in touch with you and work together, because there's a lot of work that needs to be done. Thank you so much.
Very big thank you to you, Yon. This was a rich and really superb session.